Hi class, this is Professor Cook. This is the audio and screen share portion, part one of race and ethnicity. You've hopefully already been reading, and I know you've seen the short video on the history of race in the United States. So I wanted to create a couple of audio files for you to kind of expand on some of the concepts in the slides here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, what is really interesting from a sociological perspective about race is that, as we know, and as I've said, we cannot tell based on someone's genetic makeup or composition what race they are, and different societies define race differently. However, even though something has no biological basis, it can be really important in terms of social stratification. So, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit in this chapter. So usually we start with looking at how racial ethnic compositions in the US have changed over time. So this is kind of a little graph from another book that I pulled that shows how populations in the US are changing. And the prediction is that by something like 2040 or 2050, we will be what is called a majority minority country. What that means is we will have no racial ethnic numeric majority. So as you can see, the growing populations here are people who identify as Latinx, African American, Asian American, and other. And it's a gross, kind of category here. It's too broad, but it gives us a general sense of how things are changing. So what does that mean for us in terms of our power stratification system in the US? If whites are no longer a numeric majority, will they lose the historical power and privilege that they've had and created through racist agendas in this country? Probably not, as we know. So, what is helpful to understand that is separating these concepts from a sociological perspective. Dominant and minority group is not to say something is the way it should be, right? So when we say a group is dominant, we're not implying that the group should be dominant or something like that. We're instead saying this is the group that has historically had access to power. And it does not have to be a numerically dominant or the largest group in terms of a majority, which is kind of why it's called dominant versus minority. It's referring to access to power. So, for example, in South Africa under apartheid, only 10% of the population were categorized as white, but they disproportionately controlled government and systems of power. Minority group, then, on the other hand, is any group that has been subject to differential treatment, unequal treatment. So it doesn't have to be a numeric minority. So, for example, women are included in the sort of historically minoritized group category because historically we've not had the same access to wealth, power, prestige, right? So then what is race? From a sociological perspective, race is a social construction. As I said at the beginning, only about 6 of the 35,000 genes we have determine skin color. So the way that we make meaning and create meaning around racial categories is based on how we interact as a society. Okay, this is not to say that there is not privilege and power associated with race. Of course, we definitely acknowledge that. What we mean by a social construction is that something can be different over time and it can be understood differently in different cultures. And you kind of got a sense of that from the PBS video. So racism then is the belief that people of different races possess unequal traits, and essentially it's a system of power. I want to really emphasize that, and I'll get more into that difference later. In your book, in the text, and I will talk about this, they talk about individual versus institutional discrimination and racism, and that is a really, really important distinction, as is this concept of colorblind racism. So, colorblind racism is not in the slides, but it's important to understand here because it's this idea that if I just pretend not to see race, I can ignore that things are based on, inequalities are based on racial motivations. So I'll share some examples of that when we get more into the institutional discrimination section. So if race, excuse me, I'm going to back up. If race is based on physical traits and how we understand skin color in the United States and ancestry in the United States, that's usually what we would be sort of looking at or assessing to put someone in a category. Also want to add that usually sociologists understand race as a category assigned external to the individual, so it's one of those ascribed status categories that we talked about in chapter 4. So even if what's tricky about this is even if I identify with a certain racial category, it also matters how people read me as an individual. So if I'm read by others as a different race than I identify, of course that can affect my social experience as well. So the way that I usually ask about this in class is I say something like, how many of you have been miscategorized as a race or ethnicity that you don't identify as? And that kind of gets at this concept of we judge other people based on how we understand categories when the reality is much more complicated. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we talk about race both as a structuring or a power category in society and also as an individual identity. Those are kind of two different but related concepts. Ethnicity. Okay, so if race is sort of imposed on you from the outside, ethnicity is much more how you as an individual identify with a group that shares a similar culture, religion, nationality, or language, or something like that. And usually we do not assume ethnicity unless we're looking or by looking at someone's appearance. This is a little tricky, and this is why you'll often hear me and other sociologists sort of say something mashed up and sort of confusing like racial ethnic group. What we're saying with that is that we understand that in America, at least, and in other parts of the world, we sort of racialize ethnic categories. So racialization is a different concept here, and it's somewhat complicated, but essentially what a way to think about this is to consider the category of Latinx individuals, right? So that's a lot of different ethnicities. And usually an individual, if they identify as Latinx or Hispanic, that is sort of a racialized category in this country, but someone's ethnicity could be Cuban, it could be Mexican, it could be Puerto Rican, right? And so those are all different ethnicities that are unique to one another, but they sort of get constructed as all part of one group in this country based on our historical interactions and understandings of race based on skin color and ancestry. So we could talk more about that, but I'll move on for now. So the idea of symbolic ethnicity is kind of interesting from a sociological perspective. This is when you sort of perform an ethnicity or you're sort of allowed to express that as an individual. So in the image here, you've got St. Patrick's Day, which we just had, although most of us were home. I mean, the fact that they closed the bars on St. Patrick's Day means they're really taking this coronavirus COVID stuff seriously. I don't know what we even did. Oh yes, I made my children milkshakes and tried to make them green just for something fun, but it didn't work out because I put chocolate in it and they turned a really gross brown Shrek color. So I just told them it was Shrek's swamp shake surprise. All right, but moving on. So the idea of symbolic ethnicity means you're not punished for expressing that ethnicity. And of course, that's not true for all groups in society. I'm going to pause here and then start a new video for this section.